The canyon looks empty until the walls begin to appear. At first there is only the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a wide basin of pale earth, broken mesas, dry washes, and sky so large that almost everything built by human hands seems temporary beneath it. Rain comes irregularly. Summers can burn beneath a hard blue sun, while winter nights fall far below freezing. Vegetation grows low and sparse. Water rarely lingers on the surface for long. Yet inside this difficult landscape stand the remains of buildings that once rose 4 and 5 stories high, containing hundreds of rooms, enormous circular chambers, carefully shaped masonry, and walls aligned with an architectural precision that still surprises visitors approaching them across the dust. This is Chaco Canyon, and nearly 1,000 years ago it became the center of one of the most extraordinary cultural landscapes in ancient North America. The strangest thing about Chaco is not simply that people lived here. Human communities had survived in the broader Southwest for countless generations, developing intimate knowledge of dry farming, seasonal water, local plants, and the rhythms of an environment that could reward patience and punish mistakes. What makes Chaco different is scale. Between roughly the 9th and 12th centuries, people began creating monumental structures unlike ordinary settlements. Pueblo Bonito, the most famous of them, grew into a vast D-shaped complex of rooms, plazas, storage spaces, stairways, and ceremonial chambers. Nearby stood other great houses: Chetro Ketl, Pueblo del Arroyo, Una Vida, Hungopavi, Quincletso, and more. Some were separated by significant distances, yet they shared architectural principles that suggest planning rather than accidental growth. Seen from above, the canyon begins to look less like an isolated settlement and more like the center of a system. Straight roads extend outward across the plateau. Great houses appear far beyond the canyon itself, sometimes more than 100 kilometers away, connected by architecture, pottery traditions, ceremonial forms, and perhaps political or religious relationships. Timber used in major buildings was brought from distant mountain ranges. Exotic goods arrived from places even farther away. Turquoise moved through Chaco in enormous quantities. Scarlet macaws, birds native far to the south, were kept within the canyon. Traces of cacao have been identified in ceramic vessels. Marine shells and copper bells traveled across regions that most modern observers would never imagine were linked so closely a millennium ago. Yet Chaco stands in a place where large-scale permanent settlement seems, at first glance, almost deliberately inconvenient. Annual rainfall is low and unreliable. Streams are seasonal. Crop failure is a recurring danger. The canyon itself does not provide enough large timber for monumental construction. Some scholars have estimated that hundreds of thousands of wooden beams were required across the major Chacoan structures, many of them carried from forests tens of kilometers away. The labor involved was enormous. Trees had to be cut without metal tools, trimmed, transported across rugged terrain, and raised into increasingly complex buildings. Walls were constructed with sandstone blocks shaped and arranged in distinctive masonry styles, often around carefully built cores. Rooms accumulated not as random additions but in planned architectural sequences. The people responsible were not improvising. They understood geometry, construction, seasonal solar cycles, water movement, and the limitations of their environment. Some buildings appear to contain alignments associated with solar and possibly lunar observations, although scholars still debate exactly how intentional every proposed alignment was. What survives in the record suggests a society capable of coordinating labor far beyond the scale of a single household. Whether that coordination came from religious authority, elite leadership, communal obligation, pilgrimage, kinship networks, or some combination remains one of Chaco's central mysteries. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and a mystery you enjoy. Because the deeper Chaco is examined, the less comfortably it fits into simple categories. It was once tempting to describe Pueblo Bonito as a large apartment complex filled with permanent residents. Archaeology has complicated that picture. Many rooms show surprisingly little evidence of everyday domestic activity. Hearths, household refuse, and other traces expected from densely occupied residential spaces are unevenly distributed. Some areas certainly were lived in, but parts of the great houses may have served storage, ceremony, gathering, ritual, or political functions rather than ordinary residence. This leads to a difficult question at the heart of Chaco research: what kind of place was this? Calling it a city may suggest something too familiar. Calling it a religious center may ignore evidence of economic and political organization. Calling it a trading hub cannot explain the enormous investment in architecture or the ceremonial importance of Great Kivas, the large circular spaces embedded within Chacoan communities. Calling it a capital raises another problem, because there is no surviving written record describing rulers, laws, taxes, armies, or bureaucracies of the kind associated with many ancient states elsewhere in the world. Chaco may have worked according to principles that modern categories only partially capture. Even the apparent emptiness of the canyon today can be misleading. The landscape is not abandoned in the cultural sense. Pueblo peoples across the southwest maintain histories and traditions connecting their ancestors to Chaco and to the broader region. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that the story cannot be reduced to a mysterious civilization that simply appeared and vanished. The people of Chaco belong to a much longer Pueblo history, and their descendants remain part of living communities. The mystery, then, is not where an unknown people disappeared. It is how generations of indigenous communities transformed this severe landscape into a monumental center. Why distant populations participated in the Chacoan world. What forms of authority held that world together, and why, after centuries of investment, the great houses eventually fell quiet. To understand that transformation, the enormous walls cannot be the starting point. The story begins before Pueblo Bonito became monumental, before the road stretched across the plateau, and before the canyon became a destination remembered across centuries. Beneath the famous masonry lies a quieter history of farming villages, pit houses, family communities, and generations slowly learning how to make a permanent life in the dry lands of the San Juan Basin. Long before Chaco Canyon became a place of monumental walls, broad roads, and ceremonial architecture, it was part of a much older human landscape. The great houses did not appear suddenly in an empty desert, and the people who built them were not newcomers arriving with an entirely new way of life. Their world grew out of generations of adaptation, experimentation, and memory across the San Juan Basin and the wider Colorado Plateau. To understand why Chaco eventually became extraordinary, it helps to begin with the quieter settlements that came before it, where families lived in smaller communities and where the foundations of later Pueblo society were being formed one season at a time. For thousands of years, people in the American Southwest had survived by moving through landscapes that demanded flexibility. Hunting, gathering, and careful use of seasonal plant resources shaped much of earlier life. But agriculture gradually altered that relationship. Maize, first domesticated far to the south in what is now Mexico, spread northward over many centuries. By the first millennium before the Common Era, corn was becoming increasingly important in parts of the southwest. Though it did not immediately replace older subsistence strategies, beans and squash were added later, creating a farming system that could support larger and more settled communities, but only if people understood the difficult balance between rainfall, soil, elevation, and timing. That balance was never simple. Farming in the San Juan Basin meant living with uncertainty. Rainfall could vary sharply from one year to another, and even small shifts in the timing of summer storms could determine whether maize matured successfully. Early farming communities responded not with a single strategy, but with many. Fields were placed in different ecological zones. Runoff was directed toward crops. Planting areas were selected where floodwater or seasonal moisture might linger. Wild foods continued to supplement cultivated crops. Hunting remained important. The agricultural world that eventually supported Chaco was therefore not a fragile experiment invented by inexperienced farmers. It was the result of centuries of accumulated environmental knowledge. By the early centuries of the first millennium, communities in the region were often living in structures archaeologists describe as pit houses. These were partly excavated into the earth, with walls and roofs built from wood, brush, and packed material. A pit house could provide insulation from both summer heat and winter cold, and many had central hearths, storage spaces, and features that suggest both domestic and ritual use. Clusters of these homes formed villages, sometimes accompanied by above-ground storage rooms where maize and other resources could be kept. Over time, architecture became increasingly complex. Surface structures expanded, storage became more organized, villages grew larger in some areas, pottery traditions changed, allowing food to be stored, cooked, and transported in new ways. Bows and arrows became more widespread, gradually replacing the earlier use of atlatls for much hunting. Cotton and woven materials became part of regional exchange. Communities were not isolated from one another. Networks of movement, kinship, marriage, trade, and ceremonial practice stretched across distances that modern maps can make seem more separate than they actually were. Archaeologists often place these developments within the broad sequence once called the basket maker and Pueblo periods. Though such labels are modern tools rather than identities people would have used for themselves, the terminology can give the impression of clean stages, but human life rarely changes so neatly. Some communities adopted new building methods faster than others. Farming practices varied by location. Ritual architecture evolved gradually. What matters is that by the centuries before Chaco's great florescence, the essential ingredients of Pueblo life were already present: settled villages, maize agriculture, storage, pottery, communal structures, long-distance exchange, and social relationships that extended beyond individual households. Chaco Canyon itself was occupied well before the famous monumental phase. Small settlements and pit house communities existed in and around the canyon, making use of its limited but valuable resources. The canyon could capture runoff from surrounding mesas, and its broad floor offered areas where crops might be cultivated under favorable conditions. Water was never abundant, but skilled farmers did not need a permanently flowing river to survive. They needed reliable knowledge of where water moved after storms, where sediment accumulated, where moisture remained beneath the surface, and which areas could support crops during better years. One lesser-known part of Chaco's early story is how gradual the transition toward monumental architecture appears to have been. The canyon did not change overnight from a scattered farming landscape into a ceremonial center. Early masonry structures increased in size over generations. Certain settlements became larger and more architecturally elaborate. Social differences may also have been growing, although the evidence remains incomplete. Archaeologists see changing patterns in house size, storage capacity, imported goods, and communal spaces, but translating these patterns into precise political relationships is difficult. Around the 8th and 9th centuries, something begins to shift more noticeably. Communities in Chaco and nearby regions start constructing larger above-ground room blocks. Masonry becomes increasingly sophisticated. Architectural forms that will later define the great houses begin to emerge. Some buildings appear to have been planned on scales that exceed the needs of a single family. Large communal chambers, ancestors of later Great Kivas, become more prominent. Construction starts to suggest organized labor and shared purpose. The reasons for this transformation are still debated. Population growth may have played a role. Improved agricultural productivity during favorable climatic intervals may have supported larger gatherings. Religious institutions could have become more important as communities sought ways to manage cooperation and uncertainty. Exchange networks may have concentrated wealth and influence in certain locations. Chaco's position within the San Juan Basin may have made it an effective meeting place for dispersed communities. No single explanation fully accounts for what follows. What survives in the record suggests that social life was becoming more interconnected just as architecture became more ambitious. A family living in the region around the 9th century would not necessarily have thought of itself as participating in the creation of a future cultural centre. Daily concerns remained immediate: planting maize, gathering fuel, maintaining roofs, storing food, raising children, repairing tools, finding water, and preparing for winter. Yet each generation inherited a landscape already modified by those who came before. Fields had histories, trails had destinations, ceremonial places carried memory, villages grew where earlier villages had stood. This continuity matters because later Chacoan power did not rest only on stone. It rested on relationships, traditions, and accumulated knowledge. The canyon's monumental phase becomes possible because people already know how to survive there, how to organize households, how to build collectively, and how to maintain connections across long distances. Then, around the late 9th century, those long-established patterns begin to produce something much larger. At one settlement along the northern side of the canyon floor, construction starts to accelerate. Walls become thicker, room blocks expand, architectural planning becomes more formal. The building will eventually contain hundreds of rooms and become one of the largest structures ever constructed in pre-Columbian North America. Its later name is Pueblo Bonito, and with its rise, Chaco Canyon begins to change from a place where people live into a place toward which an entire region seems to turn. Pueblo Bonito does not rise all at once. It grows through generations, each building episode adding new rooms, thicker walls, higher stories, and a stronger sense that this is no ordinary village. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, construction in Chaco Canyon is beginning to operate on a scale that would have required planning far beyond the needs of individual households. Stone is quarried and shaped in enormous quantities. Timbers brought in from forests that lie well beyond the canyon. Rooms are arranged around broad plazas. Circular ceremonial spaces are integrated into increasingly formal architectural plans. What emerges is not simply a large residence, but a monumental statement built into the desert floor. Pueblo Bonito eventually takes on its distinctive D-shaped form, with a long straight wall forming one side and a sweeping curved outer wall enclosing much of the complex. At its height, the structure contains several hundred rooms and may have risen 4 or 5 stories in places. Estimates vary because erosion, collapse, and later disturbance have changed what survives. But there is little doubt about its original scale. For centuries after its major construction phases, no building in what is now the United States would rival it in size and architectural complexity. Even today, when only part of it remains standing, the building feels less like a ruin than the exposed skeleton of an entire social system. Its walls reveal extraordinary care. Chacoan masons developed a series of masonry styles using carefully shaped sandstone veneers around a rubble core. In some walls, thin sandstone slabs were laid in tight horizontal bands. In others, larger blocks were combined with smaller stone fragments to create distinctive patterns. These were not crude barriers thrown together for shelter. Many walls were thick enough to support multiple stories, and some were built with unusual precision over considerable distances. Doorways align through sequences of rooms. Corners meet cleanly. Floors and roof systems were coordinated across large spaces. The architectural knowledge required was cumulative, and builders appear to have refined their methods over time. The most striking element may be the degree of planning. Pueblo Bonito was not simply expanded wherever space happened to remain. Major construction episodes suggest coordinated design. Walls were laid out on large scales before individual rooms were completed. Some room blocks seem to have been built as unified projects rather than household additions. The building changed over centuries, but it did so within a framework that appears deliberate. That raises a difficult question. Who had the authority to organize work at this scale? There is no written Chacoan record explaining leadership. No carved lists of rulers survive. No monuments announce kings. Archaeologists must infer social organization from architecture, burials, goods, food remains, and patterns of construction. The evidence suggests that substantial labor could be mobilized, but the mechanism remains uncertain. Some scholars envision influential ritual specialists or elite lineages. Others emphasize cooperation among communities linked by kinship and ceremony. Still others see Pueblo Bonito as a regional gathering place that was periodically filled by visitors rather than densely occupied year-round. The evidence remains incomplete, and none of these models explains every feature. One clue comes from the building itself. If Pueblo Bonito had housed hundreds or even thousands of permanent residents, archaeologists would expect intense domestic traces throughout the complex: many hearths, constant refuse deposits, large quantities of everyday cooking debris, and repeated remodeling associated with ordinary household life. Those traces do exist, but not evenly enough to match the image of every room filled with families. Many spaces appear to have been used infrequently, for storage, ritual, specialized activity, or functions that are difficult to reconstruct. Some rooms were sealed, others were accessible only through neighboring rooms or roof openings. The internal layout often seems poorly suited to the simple model of a crowded apartment block. The plazas tell a related story. Large open spaces within the great houses created places where groups could assemble. Circular structures known as kivas, traditionally interpreted as ceremonial rooms, are especially important. Smaller kivas appear throughout Pueblo Bonito, while larger examples exist elsewhere in the canyon. These spaces may have supported religious ceremonies, community decision-making, teaching, feasting, or activities that crossed boundaries modern categories impose between religion and politics. Among Pueblo peoples today, Ceremonial spaces and social organization are deeply embedded in community life, but direct one-to-one comparison with Chaco must be made carefully. 1,000 years separate modern communities from Chaco's major building era, and traditions have changed in complex ways. Even so, indigenous knowledge provides an essential reminder that great houses were not simply engineering projects. They were parts of lived cultural landscapes involving ancestry, sacred geography, social identity, and obligations extending beyond architecture. Construction itself may have carried ceremonial importance. Building a great house required people from different places to work together, quarry stone, prepare mortar, carry timbers, raise walls, and coordinate food and water for labourers. The process could have strengthened alliances and social bonds. A monumental building can become powerful not only because of what happens inside it, but because generations participate in creating it. One surprising detail is how frequently Chacoan builders altered or even enclosed earlier architectural features. Rooms could be blocked off, doorways were sealed, new walls were laid over older arrangements. Construction sometimes appears to preserve earlier spaces inside later ones, rather than simply demolishing them. This suggests that architecture accumulated history. A wall may have mattered because ancestors built it. A room could retain significance long after its practical use ended. Pueblo Bonito was therefore not just growing physically, it was becoming layered with memory. The relationship between the building and the sky also draws attention. Some researchers have proposed that major walls and architectural features align with significant solar directions, including the positions of sunrise and sunset at seasonal turning points. Broader Chacoan sites have also been linked to possible lunar observations. Certain alignments are persuasive, while others remain debated. Scholars still argue over how much astronomical knowledge was deliberately encoded into great house architecture. Yet even without accepting every proposed alignment, the orientation of buildings clearly mattered, and builders were capable of remarkable spatial precision. By the 10th century, Pueblo Bonito is no longer alone. Other great houses begin to expand through this canyon. Chetro Ketl develops an enormous plaza and hundreds of rooms. Una Vida grows near the eastern entrance. Peñasco Blanco rises on the canyon rim. Pueblo del Arroyo eventually occupies a position near the wash. The canyon is filling with monumental architecture, but not in the dense pattern of a conventional urban centre. Great houses stand separated by open landscape. Smaller residential sites, fields, paths, and ceremonial spaces. This unusual arrangement may be one reason Chaco remains difficult to define. A city normally concentrates population. Chaco seems to concentrate significance. People could have lived in smaller settlements around the great houses while entering monumental buildings for specific purposes. Visitors may have arrived during ceremonial events or seasonal gatherings. Goods may have been stored there. Certain families or ritual specialists could have occupied privileged rooms. Different great houses may even have served different communities within a wider network. What survives in the record suggests that architecture had become a language of connection. A great house could announce participation in something larger than the immediate settlement. Its masonry, room arrangement, kivas, and orientation linked it to patterns appearing elsewhere in the Chacoan world. And those patterns soon extend far beyond the canyon. Across the San Juan Basin, communities begin constructing buildings that resemble Chaco's great houses. Some stand dozens or even hundreds of kilometers away. Between them run pathways and roads whose scale seems disproportionate to ordinary traffic. Pottery, ceremonial practices, timber, food, and rare goods move through this expanding system. Pueblo Bonito has become monumental, but the larger mystery is only beginning. Chaco is turning into the center of a regional world whose boundaries stretch far beyond anything visible from the canyon floor. As the great houses expand inside Chaco Canyon, similar architectural ideas begin appearing far beyond its walls. The change is subtle at first, then unmistakable. Across the San Juan Basin and into neighboring regions, communities construct buildings that resemble the monumental centers of Chaco. They are not identical copies, and their local settings vary greatly, but the shared features are difficult to ignore: large masonry room blocks, formal plazas, distinctive kivas, carefully planned layouts, and construction techniques that echo the great houses of the canyon. A regional network is taking shape, and Chaco appears to sit near its heart. Some of these outlying great houses stand only a short distance from the canyon. Others lie tens or even hundreds of kilometers away. Archaeologists have identified Chacan-style sites across a broad area of the Four Corners region, stretching into what are now New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah. Places such as Aztec ruins, Salmon ruins, Quinbiniola, Pueblo Pintado, and many smaller centers share enough architectural and material similarities to suggest that Chaco's influence reached far beyond a single valley. Yet influence is an imprecise word. It can describe political control, religious prestige, trade relationships, imitation, migration, kinship, or all of these at once. Scholars still debate exactly what connected these communities. The temptation is to imagine Chaco as the capital of an ancient state, commanding a network of provincial settlements. The architecture can make this model seem plausible. Great houses require substantial labor. Roads link important sites. Valuable goods move through the region. Certain building forms repeat across great distances. But archaeology has not uncovered the kind of administrative apparatus expected from a centralized empire. There are no surviving written decrees, no standardized taxation records, no obvious military garrisons, and no monumental images celebrating rulers or conquest. If authority radiated outward from Chaco, it operated differently from many Old World states. Another model sees the canyon as a ceremonial center. Communities throughout the region may have recognized Chaco as a place of unusual religious importance and built local great houses that connected them symbolically to it. People might have traveled to the canyon for periodic gatherings, rituals, exchanges, or major construction events. Under this interpretation, similarity in architecture reflects shared participation in a sacred tradition rather than direct political rule. Yet this explanation also leaves unanswered questions. Why invest so heavily in storage, road construction, and large room blocks if ceremonial pilgrimage was the only purpose? Why were some outlying sites so substantial? No single explanation fully accounts for this regional pattern. The most likely reality may have been more complicated than any single category. Religion, politics, trade, ancestry, and social obligation are separated neatly in modern analysis, but they need not have been separated in Chacan life. A family visiting a distant great house could be participating in ceremony, exchanging goods, renewing kinship ties, contributing labor, and affirming loyalty at the same time. A road could serve travelers while also carrying symbolic meaning. A building could store maize while functioning as a place of ritual authority. The modern desire to assign one primary function may say more about modern institutions than about the ancient Southwest. What survives in the record suggests that Chacan connections were maintained through repeated movement. Pottery provides one important clue. Ceramic styles can reveal where vessels were produced and how they traveled. Large quantities of pottery found in Chaco include wares made outside the canyon, indicating that goods and perhaps people were regularly arriving from distant communities. Some vessels may have carried food, others were used for serving, storage, or ceremony. Their movement creates a map of relationships that is not always visible in architecture alone. Food may also have entered Chaco from outside. The canyon's agricultural potential was real, but limited. During favorable periods, local farmers could produce maize, squash, and beans using runoff and carefully selected fields. Yet supporting major gatherings or intensive construction could have required additional supplies. Studies of maize remains have suggested that at least some corn consumed in Chaco may have been grown elsewhere, though tracing ancient crops to precise source regions remains difficult. If food was regularly carried into the canyon, that implies organized networks of contribution or exchange. People were moving too. Human mobility in the ancient Southwest was probably far greater than older archaeological models once assumed. Marriage connected communities, families relocated in response to drought, conflict, opportunity, or social obligations. Ritual specialists may have traveled between settlements. Skilled masons could have moved from one building project to another. Traders carried objects over long distances. The regional Chacoan system was therefore not a fixed map of isolated villages connected by occasional trade. It was a living landscape shaped by continuous circulation. One of the more surprising clues comes from architecture itself. Some outlying great houses appear in communities where the surrounding population remained relatively modest. Their scale seems disproportionate to the number of people who could have lived there permanently. This mirrors the puzzle inside Chaco Canyon. If these structures were not designed simply to house everyone nearby, they may have functioned as focal points for larger social groups spread across the countryside. A great house could represent a community without containing it. That possibility changes the way the entire Chacoan landscape appears. Instead of a city surrounded by suburbs, Chaco may have anchored a network of dispersed populations. Families lived near fields and water sources, often in small settlements, while monumental architecture marked places of gathering, ceremony, storage, authority, or shared identity. The power of the system rested not on packing people together, but on connecting them across distance. Those connections could extend beyond practical geography. Certain Chacoan buildings and roads appear oriented toward prominent landscape features, including mesas, shrines, and distant landmarks. Natural features may have carried ancestral or ceremonial meaning. Among many indigenous traditions of the Southwest, landscape is not empty space separating settlements. Mountains, springs, canyons, and directional pathways can be part of social and sacred geography. Archaeologists cannot simply project modern beliefs backward unchanged, but the broader lesson is important distance itself may have been culturally meaningful. The spread of Chacoan architecture also reflects a remarkable degree of shared knowledge. Builders in distant communities understood techniques associated with the canyon's great houses, plans, measurements, masonry traditions, and ceremonial forms had to be communicated somehow. There were no printed manuals or architectural drawings surviving in the record. Knowledge moved through people. Someone had seen how these structures were built. Someone knew how to organize the work. Someone understood what made a building recognizably Chacoan. By the 11th century, this network reaches its greatest extent. The canyon contains multiple monumental complexes. Outlying great houses anchor distant communities. Goods travel across the region. Shared ceremonial architecture links places separated by days of walking. The Chacoan world has become large enough that its maintenance requires constant movement, cooperation, and communication. And etched across that expanding landscape is one of its most mysterious features: roads. Not narrow footpaths worn gradually into the ground, but broad, engineered corridors, sometimes running with astonishing straightness across open country. They descend cliffs by stairways cut into stone. They cross terrain where easier routes were available. Some appear to connect major settlements, while others seem to head toward places with little obvious economic value. Their scale is so unusual that practical transportation alone struggles to explain them. If the great houses reveal the size of Chacoan ambition, the roads reveal how far that ambition reached. The roads of Chaco Canyon do not behave like ordinary roads. They can be remarkably broad, sometimes approaching 9 meters across, and in places they run with a straightness that seems almost stubborn. Rather than bending gently around every obstacle, some routes appear to continue toward their destination, even when cliffs, ridges, or uneven ground stand in the way, where necessary. Chacan builders cut stairways into rock faces or created ramps to maintain a route that seems to have mattered for reasons beyond simple convenience. Seen on the ground, portions can be difficult to recognize. Seen from the air, their geometry becomes much more striking, extending outward from great houses across the pale desert, as if someone had drawn lines onto the land. Hundreds of kilometers of possible road segments have been identified across the wider Chacoan region, although not every proposed feature is accepted by all researchers. Some are clearly engineered, others are faint and difficult to distinguish from natural alignments, later tracks, or unrelated landscape features. The evidence remains incomplete, but the best preserved examples leave little doubt that substantial effort went into creating routes far wider and more formal than narrow trails required for ordinary foot traffic. That alone creates a puzzle. People in the ancient Southwest travelled constantly, but most movement did not require a road several meters wide. There were no wheeled carts moving bulk goods through Chaco, and there were no draft animals comparable to horses or oxen before European arrival centuries later. Travellers moved on foot, carrying loads themselves. A practical footpath could be narrow, winding, and adapted to the easiest terrain. Chacoan roads often seem to do the opposite. The most famous network is associated with routes extending northward from the canyon, commonly referred to as the Great North Road. Portions lead from the monumental core towards sites on the northern landscape, including Pueblo Alto and beyond. The system does not simply connect major population centers in the most efficient way. Instead, it appears to maintain a strong directional logic. This has encouraged interpretations that see some roads as ceremonial or symbolic pathways rather than purely economic infrastructure. Yet practical uses should not be dismissed. Roads could have aided the movement of people arriving for gatherings, construction projects, or ritual events. They could have marked reliable routes through a landscape where seasonal travel was frequent. Goods may have been carried along at least some portions. Travelers approaching a great house from a distant settlement would have benefited from visible corridors and cleared paths. Still, the width, straightness, and labor invested in certain roads suggest that utility alone does not tell the whole story. In several places, road segments descend from mesas using carefully constructed stairways. Cutting steps into sandstone takes effort, especially when an easier winding trail could potentially bypass a steep slope. The choice to preserve a direct alignment implies that direction itself mattered. The route may have been intended to connect not simply two settlements, but two meaningful points in the landscape. This idea becomes more compelling when the roads are considered alongside Pueblo relationships with geography. Among many Pueblo communities, movement through the landscape can carry ceremonial, ancestral, and social meaning. Sacred places are connected through memory, origin traditions, pilgrimage, and directional symbolism. Archaeologists must be careful not to assume that modern traditions reproduce Chacoan beliefs exactly, but indigenous perspectives have helped challenge older interpretations that treated the desert between archaeological sites as empty space. For the people who lived there, the land itself could be structured by stories and obligations. A road, then, might have been something more than transportation. It could make a relationship visible. If two great houses belong to communities linked through ancestry, ceremony, or alliance, a formal road between them could express that connection physically. If a route pointed toward an important mountain, shrine, or place associated with migration history, its destination might not need to contain a large settlement at all. The journey itself could have been part of the meaning. In that sense, the road system may have functioned partly as architecture stretched across the landscape. Some routes appear associated with features sometimes called herraduras, small U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped structures found near road corridors and other significant locations. Their purpose remains uncertain. They may have been shrines, markers, ritual installations, or features serving functions no longer recoverable from archaeology. Their presence adds another layer to the impression that movement through the Chacoan world was organized culturally as well as practically. There is also evidence that roads were intentionally cleared and constructed rather than simply created by repeated footsteps. In some areas, vegetation and surface material were removed. Berm-like edges or low masonry features may mark parts of certain routes. Roadbeds were sometimes leveled or cut into slopes. These actions required collective labor, and like the great houses, they would have demanded coordination. The surprising part is that Chacoan builders seem to have invested that labor in routes whose economic value was not always obvious. This has produced several competing explanations. One proposes that the roads were components of a redistribution system, helping goods move between outlying communities in the canyon. Another emphasizes pilgrimage, with broad roads guiding groups toward ceremonial centers. Some researchers argue that roads expressed political power, creating visible links within a regional hierarchy. Others see directional symbolism and connections to ancestral places as central. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A ceremonial road could carry food. A political route could also be sacred. A pilgrimage could include trade. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire network, and different roads may not have served identical purposes. The North Road is especially intriguing because of its apparent relationship with locations beyond the major settlement zone. Some interpretations suggest that the route may have connected Chaco symbolically with the north as a direction of origin or emergence in ancestral traditions. Such ideas are difficult to demonstrate archaeologically and remain debated, particularly because oral traditions cannot simply be projected backward without careful collaboration with descendant communities. Even so, the fact that some roads seem to continue toward landscapes without obvious economic targets keeps symbolic explanations alive. Elsewhere, roads connect great houses more directly. Here their function may have been easier to understand. The sight of a broad, formal route leading into a monumental complex would have changed the experience of approaching it. A traveller would no longer be wandering through an ordinary rural landscape. The road itself could announce entry into a space of importance, much as avenues, processional ways, and monumental approaches shaped human movement in other ancient societies. Chacoan roads may have controlled how important places were encountered. That experience matters because Chaco's monuments were never viewed only from above, as they so often are today in aerial photographs. Ancient visitors saw them while walking. The walls appeared slowly on the horizon. Mesas framed the route. A road might descend toward a plaza or line up with the mass of a great house. Architecture, direction, distance, and anticipation could work together. By the early 11th century, the canyon and its surrounding network had become a landscape deliberately organized at several scales. Individual rooms were carefully planned. Great houses were arranged around plazas and ceremonial spaces. Buildings related to one another across the canyon. Roads extended those relationships over immense distances. Yet maps of roads and monuments can make the Chacoan world seem abstract, as though it were built by geometry rather than people. Behind every straight line were feet walking through dust. Behind every wall were hands lifting stone. Fires had to be fed, children grew up, food was prepared, roofs leaked and required repair. Winters became cold enough to make thick masonry seem suddenly very practical. The monuments may dominate what survives, but Chaco was also a place of ordinary human life. And inside those enormous walls, the traces of that life create another mystery, because the people who used the great houses did not always live in them in the way archaeologists once expected. Inside the great houses, Chaco becomes more difficult to understand. The exterior scale suggests crowds, hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, broad plazas, and ceremonial chambers seem to imply a dense population living permanently inside the monumental complexes. Early interpretations often imagined Pueblo Bonito almost as a vast apartment building, a place filled with families cooking, sleeping, storing food, raising children, repairing tools, and carrying out the constant routines of daily life. But as excavation became more careful and comparisons with ordinary residential settlements improved, that picture began to weaken. Many rooms simply do not contain the intensity of domestic evidence expected from continuous occupation. Hearths are unevenly distributed. Everyday refuse is surprisingly limited in some areas. Storage spaces appear abundant. Certain rooms seem to have been entered rarely, if at all. The architecture is enormous, but the human footprint inside it can feel strangely light. This does not mean the great houses were empty. People certainly lived and worked there, and some rooms contain clear evidence of ordinary domestic activity. Fires burned, food was prepared, corn was ground, tools were repaired, pottery broke and accumulated in refuse, roofs had to be maintained, walls replastered, floors cleaned, and water carried through the canyon. Yet these activities do not appear everywhere in equal measure. Instead, Pueblo Bonito and other major buildings seem to have combined multiple functions, some residential, some ceremonial, some related to storage or administration, and some still impossible to identify with confidence. The distribution of hearths is one of the most revealing clues. In ordinary household rooms, a hearth is a practical necessity. It provides heat during cold nights and allows food to be cooked. If hundreds of rooms had been permanently occupied by families, archaeologists would expect many more of them to contain clear cooking features. Instead, large portions of the great houses lack such evidence. Some rooms were probably storerooms. Others may have been used during gatherings or for specialized activities. Some may have served as repositories for objects whose meaning extended beyond simple economic value. Storage itself appears to have been extremely important. Maize could be kept in sealed rooms for long periods, protecting it from pests and weather. In a region where rainfall fluctuated and crop yields could vary dramatically, stored food was more than convenience. It was security. A community able to accumulate surplus could survive a bad season more effectively, support construction crews, host visitors, or redistribute food during ritual events. Yet it remains uncertain whether Chaco's storage system represented communal reserves, elite control, household wealth, ceremonial offerings, or some mixture of these. Grinding stones provide another glimpse of daily labor. Maize had to be transformed before it could become a meal, and that required enormous repetitive effort. Women in Pueblo societies historically performed much of the grinding, though archaeologists must be cautious when assigning ancient labor roles directly from later ethnographic patterns. Metates and manos found across settlements reveal the physical routine behind agricultural life. Corn kernels were ground against stone again and again until they became meal. The process consumed hours. Stone surfaces gradually wore smooth under generations of use. The monumental landscape can make this kind of labor almost invisible, but Chaco could not function without it. Every gathering required food. Every construction project required workers to be fed. Every winter depended on successful harvests, storage, fuel, clothing, and roof maintenance. The people who raised great houses still woke to ordinary problems: a cracked vessel, a damaged sandal, a leaking ceiling, a child who needed care, a field threatened by drought. Fuel was another constant concern. The canyon did not offer unlimited firewood. Small shrubs and local trees could be gathered nearby, but intensive use risked exhausting accessible supplies. Larger construction timbers came from distant forests. While everyday fuel may have been obtained through a combination of local collection and longer trips, fires had to be managed carefully. Winters in the high desert are severe, and masonry rooms can become bitterly cold once the sun disappears. People living in Chaco were surrounded by a landscape that demanded attention every day. Water was even more immediate. There was no permanent river running through the canyon. Seasonal storms sent water rushing through washes, sometimes violently, but long dry periods were normal. Households likely stored water in ceramic vessels and used runoff captured from different parts of the landscape. The physical act of carrying water would have shaped daily schedules, particularly during crowded gatherings. A monumental center with hundreds or thousands of temporary visitors could strain local resources rapidly. This possibility helps explain why population estimates for Chaco vary so widely. Some researchers argue that the canyon supported a substantial permanent population, while others believe relatively few people lived inside the largest great houses and that the population increased dramatically during periodic events. Scholars still debate the numbers because archaeological traces do not translate neatly into head counts. A room can be occupied seasonally, used for storage, abandoned, reopened, or repurposed many times over centuries. Ceremonial spaces deepen the uncertainty. Kivas appear throughout the Chacoan landscape, from small examples associated with residential groups to enormous Great Kivas capable of accommodating large gatherings. These circular or semi-subterranean structures often contain benches, floor vaults, hearths, pilasters, and other carefully constructed features. Their exact functions varied, but they clearly mattered socially. Activities held inside may have included ritual performance, teaching, communal decision-making, feasting, initiation, or the maintenance of group identity. A particularly striking feature of Chacoan life is the contrast between intimate spaces and enormous collective ones. A person might spend much of the year in a modest household settlement, tending fields and managing ordinary tasks, then enter a great house whose scale was completely different from domestic architecture. The psychological effect must have been powerful. Thick walls rose several stories overhead. Doorways formed long sequences through room blocks. Plazas opened suddenly between massive masonry wings. Great Kivas created enclosed spaces where voices, movement, and ritual could be concentrated. Even food could become part of this transformation. Archaeological deposits suggest episodes of large-scale consumption and feasting in parts of the Chacoan world. Feasts are never only about calories. They create obligations, display generosity, reinforce alliances, and draw people together through shared experience. A host able to feed many visitors could gain prestige. A ritual gathering could transform stored maize into social power. But the evidence does not show a simple centralized economy, and no single explanation fully accounts for how food, ceremony, and authority interacted. The remains of animals add further detail. Turkey became increasingly important in the ancient southwest, providing meat and feathers, while deer, rabbits, and other wild animals were hunted. Feathers could be woven into warm blankets particularly suited to cold desert nights. Bones reveal patterns of butchery and consumption, but they also hint at exchange and social difference. Certain animal remains appear in unusual contexts that may have had ritual significance. Human burials are rarer and more unevenly distributed than one might expect from a densely populated city. Some are ordinary, others, especially within Pueblo Bonito, are extraordinary in ways that will later become central to arguments about hierarchy and inherited status. For the moment, their most important lesson is that not everyone appears to have been treated the same after death. That inequality sits beside evidence of cooperation. Chaco could not have been built without collective work. Yet collective work does not necessarily mean equal power. Communities can cooperate while still containing privileged families, ritual specialists, or leaders. The relationship between ordinary households and those who controlled certain rooms, goods, ceremonies, or stored resources may have defined much of Chacoan life. What survives in the records suggests a society in which daily existence and monumental purpose constantly overlapped. The person grinding corn in a small room was part of the same world as the people entering a Great Kiva. The farmer watching storm clouds over distant mesas helped sustain the same system that raised 5-story walls. Chaco's mystery lies partly in this scale shift, from the intimate labor of individual households to institutions capable of organizing an entire region. And nowhere is that organization more astonishing than in the materials themselves. Every major roof beam, every carefully shaped wall, and every stored vessel depended on resources that the canyon could not always provide. The stone was nearby, but much of the timber was not. Water had to be captured. Food had to be grown under unstable conditions. To keep Chaco alive, people had to overcome logistical problems that became more severe as the monumental center expanded. The great houses were therefore not only architectural achievements, they were machines of supply. The walls of Chaco are built from local stone, but the roofs tell a different story. Look upward inside the surviving rooms of the great houses and the problem becomes immediately visible. Massive wooden beams once crossed from wall to wall, supporting layers of smaller poles, brush, and packed earth above them. Thousands upon thousands of these timbers were needed, not only for roofs, but also for upper floors, door lintels, structural reinforcement, and repeated repairs. Yet Chaco Canyon itself could not supply enough large, straight trees for such construction. The builders had to reach outward into distant forests, cut mature timber with stone tools, and somehow carry it back across the high desert. This was not an occasional inconvenience. It was one of the defining logistical challenges of the Chacoan world. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, has made the timber story unusually precise. Many surviving beams can be dated to the exact year in which the tree stopped growing, giving archaeologists a chronological record of construction that stone alone could never provide. These dates reveal pulses of intense building activity, sometimes with large numbers of trees felled within relatively short periods. Chemical and isotopic studies have also helped identify likely source areas. Much of the construction timber appears to have come from mountain ranges tens of kilometers away, including the Chusca Mountains to the west and other upland forests surrounding the San Juan Basin. The distances are difficult to appreciate until the transport is imagined physically. There are no pack animals. There are no wheeled wagons. A long ponderosa pine beam can weigh hundreds of kilograms. It has to be cut, trimmed, and moved by people using ropes, teamwork, and sheer effort. The exact methods remain uncertain because nothing like an instruction manual survives. But the scale of transport is undeniable. Thousands of journeys must have connected mountain forest to canyon floor. This suggests more than engineering skill. It suggests organization. Someone had to know which forest could provide suitable timber. Cutting had to happen at appropriate times. Labor had to be coordinated. Workers needed food and water while moving through remote terrain. Trails had to be known. Beams had to arrive in sequences that matched construction schedules. A building project could stall if timber failed to appear. The supply system behind a great house may have been almost as complex as the masonry visible today. One lesser-known detail is that Chacoan builders often selected straight, mature trees that had grown in relatively dense forests. These were not random pieces of wood gathered opportunistically. Their dimensions mattered. A beam too short could not span a planned room. A twisted trunk could create structural weakness. Timber selection therefore implies standards and knowledge extending into distant upland environments. What survives in the record suggests that builders understood not only architecture, but the geography of resource zones surrounding the canyon. Wood was also consumed in ordinary life, although differently. Fuel for cooking and heating had to be collected continually. Small shrubs, deadwood, and local vegetation probably supplied much of this need, but growing population or repeated large gatherings could place pressure on nearby resources. Over time, people may have had to travel farther for fuel. Archaeologists have explored whether local woodland depletion contributed to Chaco's vulnerability. Though the extent and importance of deforestation remain debated, the canyon was never a lush forest that people simply stripped bare. Its natural environment was already dry. Even so, concentrated human demand mattered. Water presented an even more immediate constraint. Rain in the San Juan Basin is not only limited but erratic. Some storms arrive as intense summer downpours, sending sudden sheets of water across exposed ground. Much of that water disappears rapidly into washes or evaporates. Chacoan farmers learned to exploit these brief events. Fields could be placed where runoff from mesas and slopes spread across flatter ground, depositing moisture and sediment. Small diversion features and other forms of water control may have redirected runoff toward agricultural zones. Natural topography did much of the work, but human knowledge determined where farming was likely to succeed. The canyon's main wash was both useful and dangerous. When water flowed, It could replenish soil moisture and reshape the floodplain. But channel behavior changed over time. Erosion could cut deeper arroyos into the canyon floor, lowering water tables and making fields harder to irrigate naturally. Scholars still debate the timing and severity of different episodes of arroyo formation, and it would be too simple to say that one erosion event destroyed Chaco. Yet changing water dynamics added uncertainty to a system already living close to environmental limits. Agriculture depended heavily on maize. Beans and squash supplemented the diet, while wild plants and hunted animals remained important. Maize is remarkably adaptable, but it is not forgiving of every climatic shift. A few badly timed frosts, a weak monsoon, or a sequence of dry years could reduce harvests sharply. Farmers therefore spread risk across locations. Some fields were planted close to the canyon floor. Others may have been cultivated in side valleys or higher areas with slightly different rainfall patterns. At times, food probably arrived from outside Chaco as well. Chemical studies of ancient maize have suggested that some corn consumed in the canyon may have come from distant regions. Though identifying exact source zones is technically difficult, and interpretations continue to change. If outside communities contributed food regularly, Chaco was partly sustained by the larger network it helped organize. That would make the canyon less an isolated settlement and more a regional center dependent on circulation. This dependency could be a strength during good times. A broad network allows resources to move from areas with surplus to areas experiencing shortage. Different elevations receive rain differently. A drought affecting one valley might leave another less damaged. Social relationships can therefore function as environmental insurance. Communities tied together by ceremony, kinship, exchange, or obligation can share risk across a wider landscape. But networks also create vulnerability. If many communities suffer bad harvests at the same time, there is nowhere to draw surplus from. If gatherings become difficult to support, participation may decline. If labor obligations become too expensive, people may stop providing workers. A system that thrives through cooperation can weaken rapidly when cooperation no longer provides enough benefit. During the height of Chaco's building era, however, the system still appears capable of mobilizing astonishing resources. Beams arrive from distant mountains. Masonry grows higher. Roads remain active. Great houses continue to receive imported goods. Water systems and farming strategies support communities living in one of North America's more unpredictable agricultural landscapes. The achievement is easy to romanticize, but the daily reality must have involved constant calculation. Every roof beam represents a journey. Every stored basket of maize represents months of uncertainty successfully overcome. Every jar of water represents labor. The monumental world depends on thousands of ordinary acts repeated without failure for generations. And then there are objects that cannot be explained by necessity at all. Bright turquoise appears in extraordinary quantities. Marine shells come from distant coasts. Copper bells arrive from the south. Scarlet macaws. Tropical birds whose natural range lies far from Chaco are transported alive into the desert. Even cacao, a plant that cannot grow anywhere near the canyon, leaves chemical traces inside ceremonial vessels. The same network that carries timber and food is also carrying prestige, symbolism, and ideas across distances of hundreds and perhaps thousands of kilometers. Chaco is not merely surviving the desert. It is connected to a much larger world. Some of the most revealing objects found at Chaco are also the least expected. In a landscape of sandstone, sage, dry washes, and distant mountain forests, archaeologists uncovered brilliant blue-green turquoise in quantities that immediately suggested something more than casual decoration. Thousands of pieces, beads, pendants, fragments, and worked stones have been recovered from Chacoan contexts, especially at Pueblo Bonito. Some were unfinished, some carefully shaped, and some associated with burials or rooms that appear to have held unusual significance. Turquoise was available in parts of the southwest, but the amount moving through Chaco suggests that the canyon became deeply involved in acquiring, working, storing, exchanging, or symbolically concentrating this valued material. Its importance is difficult to reduce to simple economics. Turquoise is visually striking, but value in ancient societies is created by culture as much as scarcity. It may have signaled identity, ritual status, beauty, affiliation, or prestige. Some pieces were transported long distances before reaching Chaco. Others may have moved outward again after being worked. The canyon seems to have occupied an important position within this circulation, but whether leaders controlled the trade, ritual specialists managed it, or many independent households participated remains uncertain. Turquoise is only the beginning. Marine shells have been found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast. Some likely originated from the Pacific side of what is now Mexico, or from the Gulf of California. Shells could be carved into pendants, bracelets, beads, and ceremonial objects. Every one of them represents a chain of movement across environments that could not be more different from Chaco Canyon desert basins, mountain corridors, river valleys, and coastal regions. The person who finally handled a shell in Pueblo Bonito may never have seen the ocean, yet an object from that distant world had reached the canyon. Copper bells provide another southern connection. These small metal objects were produced in Mesoamerica, where copper metallurgy developed centuries before metalworking of that kind appeared locally in the southwest. Their presence in Chaco indicates that exchange networks extended far enough south to move objects created in entirely different technological traditions. The bells were not tools, they were rare objects whose sound, appearance, and foreign origin may have made them powerful symbols. Then there were the birds. Scarlet macaws do not belong in the high desert of New Mexico. Their natural habitats lie far to the south in warmer regions, where tropical and subtropical forests support the fruits and vegetation they need. Yet macaw remains have been recovered at Pueblo Bonito and other southwestern sites. Some birds were transported alive over enormous distances, probably through networks connecting the southwest with northern Mexico and beyond. Keeping a macaw alive in Chaco would have required deliberate care. It needed food, shelter, and protection from winter cold. Its brilliant red, yellow, and blue plumage would have been unlike almost anything naturally visible in the local environment. Feathers may have held ceremonial significance, but living birds could themselves have embodied status, distance, and access to unusual networks. The arrival of a scarlet macaw in the canyon must have been an event. Research on macaw remains has added a surprising chronological detail. Some birds reached Chaco earlier than researchers once expected, suggesting that long-distance southern connections were already established before the final peak of monumental development. This weakens older models in which Mesoamerican trade appears only as a late luxury attached to a mature Chacoan elite. Instead, the relationships may have been developing alongside the Chacoan system itself. The most unexpected discovery came from pottery. Researchers analyzing residues inside cylindrical vessels from Pueblo Bonito detected compounds associated with cacao, the plant used to make chocolate. Cacao cannot grow naturally anywhere near Chaco. It requires warm, humid conditions found far to the south. In Mesoamerica, cacao had ceremonial, social, and economic importance. Its presence in Chacoan vessels therefore implies that either cacao itself, cacao-based preparations, or closely associated substances were carried north across a vast distance. The cylindrical vessels are unusual even without the chemical evidence. Large numbers were found in certain rooms at Pueblo Bonito, and their form resembles vessel traditions associated with ritual drinking in parts of Mesoamerica. The resemblance does not prove that Chaco copied a specific foreign ceremony, and scholars remain cautious about claiming direct cultural transfer. But the combination of vessel form and cacao residue is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. This finding transformed perceptions of Chaco's geographic reach. For generations, popular imagination often treated pre-contact North America as a collection of isolated cultural regions. The archaeological evidence shows something much more connected. Goods, ideas, technologies, plants, animals, and people could move through chains of exchange extending across enormous distances. Chaco was not an isolated desert experiment. It was part of a continental world. That does not mean caravans traveled directly from central Mexico to Pueblo Bonito in a single journey. Long-distance trade often operates through many intermediate communities. An object can change hands repeatedly, crossing cultural boundaries without any one traveler completing the entire route. The farther it moves, the more valuable its origin may become. Distance itself can create prestige. For Chacoan leaders or ritual specialists, exotic objects may have carried a kind of authority that ordinary local goods could not. A macaw feather, a copper bell, or a cacao drink linked its holder to places beyond the familiar horizon. Such objects could demonstrate access to rare networks and reinforce social distinctions. This possibility becomes especially important when exotic goods are found in restricted contexts rather than spread evenly through ordinary households. Pueblo Bonito contains several such concentrations. Certain rooms held large caches of turquoise and unusual ritual objects. Some burials were accompanied by exceptionally rich goods. These patterns suggest that access to prestige materials was not equal. Yet scholars still debate whether this reflects a permanent hereditary elite, temporary ritual roles, collective ceremonial storage, or changing patterns across different centuries. The evidence also warns against assuming that every southern object brought southern political ideas with it. Trade does not automatically produce cultural domination. Chacoan communities selectively incorporated foreign materials into their own traditions. A copper bell may have had one meaning where it was made and a very different meaning where it ended up. Cacao could be consumed within a Chacoan ceremonial context that had little resemblance to rituals farther south. Objects travel more easily than entire belief systems. Still, the scale of contact matters. To sustain these connections, Chaco had to belong to networks that were reliable enough to move fragile living birds and rare consumable products across hundreds of kilometers. Paths through northern Mexico and the southwest must have been known and traveled repeatedly. Communities along the way provided information, shelter, food, exchange partners, and safe passage. The Chacoan world rested partly on relationships extending beyond its architectural horizon. These exotic goods also reveal something about the canyon's social atmosphere. Imagine a gathering in one of the great houses when visitors arrive from different parts of the region. Pottery styles vary. Languages or dialects may differ. Turquoise ornaments catch the light. A copper bell produces a sound unfamiliar in ordinary households. Macaw feathers appear in ceremonial clothing. a rare drink made from a plant grown far to the south, is prepared in specialized vessels. Monumental architecture surrounds the gathering. None of this proves the existence of kings, priests, or merchants in the conventional sense, but it suggests that Chaco could create experiences unavailable in most local settlements. That exclusivity may have been one source of its power. By the 11th century, the canyon is gathering not only timber, food, and labor, but meaning. Rare materials arrive because Chaco matters, and Chaco may matter even more because rare materials arrive there. Prestige reinforces ceremony. Ceremony reinforces participation. Participation makes further construction possible. The system becomes self-sustaining as long as enough communities continue to believe in its value. But belief and participation require institutions. Someone controls access to certain spaces. Someone organizes gatherings. Someone decides where valuable objects are stored and how they are used. Someone presides over ceremonies within Great Kivas and monumental plazas. Whether that authority belongs to families, ritual societies, leaders, or broader councils remains uncertain. To understand Chaco's structure, the architecture and exotic goods eventually lead back to the same unresolved issue. Who held power here, and what made others recognize it? The Great Kivas are among the clearest signs that Chaco was built for more than ordinary domestic life. They're large, circular, carefully engineered spaces, often partially sunk into the ground and surrounded by masonry that required considerable effort to construct. Some stand within great houses, while others occupy plazas or separate locations. Their floors contain features whose exact functions are still debated: hearths, benches, floor vaults, niches, and carefully arranged structural elements. In later Pueblo traditions, kivas are deeply associated with ceremony, community organization, teaching, ritual societies, and the maintenance of identity. Archaeologists cannot simply assume that every Chacoan kiva served exactly the same purposes, but their scale and placement make one thing difficult to avoid. Chaco was creating places designed for people to gather, and those gatherings were likely central to whatever held the wider regional system together. A great house without ceremonial space would already be impressive. A great house with repeated formal rooms built for collective participation becomes something else entirely. The largest Great Kivas could have accommodated substantial groups. Their entrances, benches, floor arrangements, and associated plazas suggest controlled movement and shared activity. A person entering one of these spaces would have left the open desert and stepped into an enclosed architectural environment in which attention could be focused. Light, fire, sound, movement, and social position would all have changed. Even without knowing the exact ceremonies performed, it is possible to understand why the architecture itself mattered. Chaco did not simply provide space for ritual, it shaped ritual. This makes ceremony one of the strongest explanations for the canyon's regional importance, but it does not solve the question of power. Large ceremonies require organization. People must know when to gather. Food has to be prepared. Spaces must be maintained. Objects used in ritual have to be stored and protected. Participants may need to travel for days. Someone coordinates sequences of events and decides who enters particular rooms. Some people know traditions that others do not. Authority exists even if it does not resemble a king sitting on a throne. The form of that authority remains uncertain. One possibility is that influential religious specialists directed major ceremonies and helped maintain connections among outlying communities. Their legitimacy may have rested on knowledge of calendars, seasonal cycles, ancestry, cosmology, or ritual performance. in agricultural societies dependent on uncertain rainfall. Ceremonies tied to seasonal renewal and communal cooperation could carry immense importance. Those capable of organizing such events might gain prestige without ruling through force. Another possibility is that Chaco developed a more formal political hierarchy in which certain lineages controlled important buildings, stored resources, trade goods, and ceremonial knowledge. In this model, ritual and political authority may have been inseparable. A powerful family could demonstrate its status through access to turquoise, exotic birds, rare vessels, and prominent burial places. Monumental construction would become both a collective achievement and a visible expression of unequal power. Some scholars go further, suggesting that Chaco may have functioned as the center of a regional chiefdom-like system in which leaders at Pueblo Bonito or related great houses exerted authority over outlying communities. Others strongly resist this interpretation, noting the lack of obvious palaces, armies, royal monuments, or administrative texts. The canyon does not resemble the great centralized states of Mesoamerica or the Andes. But absence of those features does not prove the absence of hierarchy. Political systems can take many forms, especially when authority is embedded in kinship and ritual rather than bureaucracy. The architecture itself hints at controlled access. Some rooms within Pueblo Bonito are difficult to reach directly. Doorways were sometimes deliberately blocked. Interior routes could funnel movement through specific sequences. Certain chambers contained concentrations of unusual objects that were not distributed evenly through the building. These patterns suggest that not every person entering Pueblo Bonito had access to every space. That matters because restricted space creates social distinction. A plaza gathering may involve many people, while a small interior chamber may be reserved for only a few. Valuable objects hidden deep inside a great house may reinforce authority precisely because most people rarely see them. Ritual knowledge can function the same way. A public ceremony can depend on private preparation, secret traditions, and specialists whose status rests partly on what others are not permitted to know. One striking example comes from a series of rooms at Pueblo Bonito where unusual concentrations of artifacts were found, including turquoise and ceremonial objects. Their placement suggests deliberate deposition rather than random household loss. Some rooms may have served as storerooms for valuable materials, but economic storage alone seems insufficient to explain every context. Objects could be wealth, offerings, ritual equipment, or all three at once. The Great Kivas also reveal something about scale. A local household ritual does not require a monumental chamber. Building one suggests an audience larger than a single family. Several Great Kivas distributed across the region imply repeated gatherings among communities that may have lived considerable distances apart. These events could have renewed relationships among groups whose daily lives remained dispersed across farms and small settlements. Feasting may have been part of this process. Food consumed collectively can transform stored agricultural surplus into social obligation. A community that contributes maize to a major gathering is not simply donating calories. It is participating in a relationship. Those who host the event demonstrate generosity and organizational capacity. Those who attend reaffirm membership in a larger network. The distinction between ritual offering, taxation, redistribution, and hospitality may have been far less clear than modern categories imply. This helps explain why Chaco may have endured even though living there was difficult. The canyon did not need to be the most agriculturally productive place in the region if its importance came from something other than farming efficiency. People build monumental centers in places that matter symbolically. Pilgrimage destinations are often inconvenient. Sacred landscapes do not have to maximize economic practicality. If Chaco was connected to powerful ideas about ancestry, cosmology, direction, or communal origins, then its difficult environment might not have diminished its value. There are hints that the sky itself may have been woven into this ceremonial order. Architectural alignments associated with solar events have attracted considerable attention, and sites such as the famous Sun Dagger feature at Fajada Butte suggest careful observation of seasonal light and shadow. The feature consists of rock slabs that cast patterns across spiral petroglyphs at certain times of year. Its exact interpretation has been debated, and modern disturbance has altered the original arrangement, but it demonstrates that Chacoans paid close attention to astronomical cycles. Calendrical knowledge would have had practical as well as ceremonial significance. Planting, gathering, ritual schedules, and travel all depended on seasonal timing. A society able to coordinate events across a broad region needed shared concepts of time. Observations of the sun, moon, stars, and horizon could help create that shared rhythm. What survives in the record suggests that Chaco's power may have depended less on coercion than on participation in a system of meaning. People came because gatherings mattered. They contributed because relationships mattered. Great houses mattered because they embodied those relationships in stone. But systems built on meaning still create winners. If some families controlled ceremonial knowledge, exotic goods, important rooms, or ancestral claims, then inequality may have become embedded within the very institutions that united the region. The question of who held power cannot be answered through architecture alone. The dead offer more disturbing evidence. Deep within Pueblo Bonito, a small number of burials received treatment so different from most others that they have forced archaeologists to reconsider the possibility that Chacoan authority was inherited rather than earned. And if that interpretation is correct, the canyon may have been far more socially unequal than its communal architecture first suggests. The burials inside Pueblo Bonito do not look like the graves of an entirely equal society. Most people who lived within the wider Chacoan world were not buried with spectacular displays of wealth. Many graves across the region are comparatively modest, and the archaeological record is uneven enough that large portions of the population remain almost invisible after death. But inside Pueblo Bonito, a small number of burials receive treatment so elaborate that they stand apart immediately. One burial in particular contained a man placed with thousands of turquoise beads and pendants, shell ornaments, and other valued objects. Another individual was buried nearby. The concentration of wealth was extraordinary, and because these burials were positioned within one of Chaco's most important buildings, they became central to a larger question: did Pueblo Bonito contain a hereditary elite? For much of the 20th century, many archaeologists were cautious about describing Chaco in terms of kings, dynasties, or inherited political power. Pueblo societies known historically often emphasize forms of community organization that do not resemble centralized monarchy, and researchers were wary of imposing old-world political categories onto the southwest. That caution remains important. Chaco produced no royal inscriptions, no carved thrones, and no monuments naming individual rulers. Yet archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that differences in status could be substantial. The richest Pueblo Bonito burials are difficult to explain as ordinary household graves. Turquoise appears in quantities requiring access to significant networks of acquisition and production. Valuable shell objects accompany some individuals. Burial location itself may have been meaningful, because these people were placed within a monumental complex that already possessed regional significance. If certain families controlled prestigious rooms, rare goods, or ceremonial knowledge, burial inside Pueblo Bonito could reinforce their connection to the institution even after death. Then genetics introduced a new and controversial clue. Researchers studying ancient DNA from a sequence of individuals buried within one Pueblo Bonito room found evidence that several shared the same mitochondrial lineage. Because mitochondrial DNA is inherited primarily through the maternal line, this pattern suggested that at least some of the people buried there belonged to a maternal kin group, extending across multiple generations. The individuals span a substantial period of time, potentially centuries, which raised the possibility that access to this prestigious burial location was inherited through descent. The finding attracted attention because it appeared to support the existence of a long-lasting elite lineage. But the interpretation requires care. Sharing maternal ancestry does not automatically prove political rule. A prominent ritual lineage could maintain privileged burial rites without governing the entire Chacoan region. The sample represents only a small number of individuals from one location, not the complete population of Pueblo Bonito. Ancient DNA also raises important ethical concerns, especially when studying the ancestors of living indigenous peoples. Archaeological science increasingly depends on consultation and collaboration with descendant communities, and older practices that treated ancestral remains simply as research material have faced justified criticism. Even with these limitations, the burial evidence makes strict egalitarian models difficult to maintain. Some individuals clearly had access to objects and burial treatment unavailable to most others. The harder question is what that difference meant during life. One possibility is that Pueblo Bonito housed a group whose authority was based on ancestry. Members of a particular lineage may have claimed special relationships with founding ancestors, sacred knowledge, or ceremonial responsibilities. Their status could have passed through family lines while remaining embedded within broader communal institutions. Such a system would not necessarily resemble a monarchy. Power might have been distributed among several houses, clans, ritual societies, or leadership groups, some of which gained greater influence at different times. Another interpretation places greater emphasis on religious office. Those buried with unusual wealth may have been high-ranking ceremonial figures rather than secular rulers. In many societies, ritual authority controls valuable objects because those objects belong to ceremonies rather than individuals. Turquoise, shells, feathers, and rare imported goods could function as sacred materials instead of personal luxury. A richly furnished burial, therefore, does not tell archaeologists exactly how much political authority that person exercised. Yet religion and politics may be impossible to separate here. If certain people determined when ceremonies occurred, controlled access to Great Kivas, maintained ancestral knowledge, coordinated pilgrimages, and managed stored goods, they already possessed forms of power. If they could mobilize labor for great house construction or obtain exotic materials through distant networks, their influence extended into economics and regional relationships. Chaco may not have needed an army for authority to be real. Architecture supports this possibility indirectly. Monumental buildings require decisions that affect many people. Someone chooses where walls will stand. Someone directs labor. Someone maintains design continuity across years or generations. Pueblo Bonito grows through repeated construction episodes while preserving an impressive degree of architectural order. Purely spontaneous household expansion becomes increasingly difficult to imagine at such scale. The same applies to timber procurement. Expeditions into distant mountain forests needed organization. Food had to support workers. Large beams had to be transported and assigned to particular projects. Roads had to be constructed and maintained. Major ceremonial gatherings had to be scheduled. These activities do not prove centralized government, but they imply institutions capable of coordinating people across communities. The surprising feature is that Chacoan power may have depended more on networks than territory. There is little evidence that soldiers from Pueblo Bonito occupied distant communities or enforced borders. Instead, influence seems to have traveled through shared architecture, ceremonial participation, prestige goods, kinship, and perhaps obligations to contribute labor or food. A powerful Chacoan lineage would not necessarily have ruled every village directly. It might have occupied the symbolic center of a system in which distant communities participated for their own reasons. That distinction could explain why Chaco expanded so widely, without leaving obvious signs of imperial conquest. People may have joined the system because membership provided advantages, access to ceremonies, marriage networks, exchange partners, ritual knowledge, stored resources, prestigious goods, or connections to sacred places. Participation could strengthen local leaders as well as central ones. Outlying great houses may have served as regional nodes where authority was negotiated rather than simply imposed from the canyon. But such arrangements can also generate tension. If some families accumulate prestige while others provide labor, resentment can grow. If ceremonial obligations demand increasing contributions during difficult years, participation may become burdensome. If leaders claim special access to resources or supernatural authority, their legitimacy depends on the system continuing to deliver stability and meaning. For several generations, Chaco appears to have succeeded. Monumental construction reaches extraordinary intensity during the 11th century. Great houses stand across the region. Roads, ceremonies, and exchange networks connect communities over vast distances. Pueblo Bonito remains a place where rare objects and privileged burials concentrate. Yet beneath this apparent strength lies a basic weakness that no lineage or ritual institution can eliminate. The system depends on harvests. And as the 11th century gives way to the 12th, the climate becomes less forgiving, rainfall becomes increasingly unreliable, and the environmental calculations that sustained Chaco for generations begin to fail more often. For generations, Chaco's success depended on people knowing how to live with uncertainty. Dry years were not new. Farmers across the San Juan Basin had always faced irregular rainfall, early frosts, intense summer heat, and the possibility that a field carefully planted in spring might yield very little by autumn. The Chacoan system had developed partly because community were good at spreading risk. Fields could be planted in different locations. Food could be stored. Distant settlements could support one another. Ritual gatherings and exchange networks created relationships that might help families survive bad seasons. But resilience has limits, and by the late 11th and early 12th centuries, those limits were being tested more severely. Tree ring records from the broader southwest reveal repeated episodes of drought, including a major dry interval beginning in the late 11th century and another severe period in the 12th. The famous drought often associated with the decline of Chaco begins around the 1130s and continues, with regional variation, for decades. But the collapse of the Chacoan system cannot be reduced to one drought beginning on one date. Construction had already slowed in parts of the canyon. Communities were shifting, environmental pressures accumulated unevenly. What mattered was not simply that rain failed, but that an increasingly complex regional system depended on rainfall being reliable often enough to sustain fields, gatherings, labor, and exchange. A single failed harvest is painful. Several poor harvests within a generation can transform society. Maize agriculture is particularly vulnerable to timing. Total annual rainfall matters, but so does when that rain arrives. A storm falling after crops have already withered does little good. Too little moisture during germination can destroy a planting before it begins. A late frost can kill young plants, while an early autumn frost can prevent kernels from fully maturing. Farmers in the Chacoan world understood these risks and adapted creatively, but no farming strategy could eliminate them. As rainfall became less dependable, stored surplus would have become increasingly valuable. Families with deeper reserves could survive longer. Communities with access to productive fields outside the canyon might fare better than those dependent on marginal ground. If elite households or ceremonial institutions controlled substantial stores, scarcity could strengthen their authority for a time. People might become more dependent on central redistribution during shortages. But scarcity could also destroy legitimacy. If Chaco's leaders claimed ritual authority connected to seasonal order, fertility, or communal well-being, repeated agricultural failure might weaken confidence in them. There is no written testimony describing such a crisis, so this remains inference rather than fact. Yet in many societies, systems of authority are judged partly by their ability to maintain stability. If communities continue contributing food and labor while receiving less security in return, participation becomes harder to sustain. Environmental pressure was not confined to rainfall. Woodland resources around the canyon had been used for centuries. Construction demanded enormous quantities of timber, while daily life required constant fuel. By Chaco's peak, convenient sources of large beams were already distant. Whether Chacoan construction caused severe regional deforestation is still debated, and earlier claims that the canyon's inhabitants simply destroyed their environment are too simplistic. The surrounding landscape was naturally dry and sparsely wooded. Still, the need to travel farther for timber and fuel increased the cost of maintaining monumental life. Water management also became more difficult if erosion altered the canyon floor. Deepening channels could carry runoff away more quickly, reducing the spread of water across agricultural land. Fields that once benefited from shallow flooding might become less productive. Archaeologists continue to debate the exact chronology of arroyo formation, but what survives in the geological record suggests that water systems were never permanently stable. The Chacoan system therefore faced pressure from several directions at once. Drought reduced crop yields. Resource procurement demanded increasing effort. Large gatherings required food that might no longer be available in surplus. Outlying communities suffered their own environmental problems and could be less willing or able to send resources toward the canyon. The strength of a regional network becomes a weakness when every part of the network is under stress. This is important because drought alone does not automatically cause social collapse. Communities have survived extreme dry periods throughout southwestern history. People move fields, adjust diets, relocate settlements, intensify trade, change ceremonial relationships, and reorganize leadership. The relevant question is not why drought happened. It is why the existing Chacoan system became less useful under those conditions. One possibility is that the network had become too centralized around places whose symbolic importance outweighed their ecological advantages. Chaco Canyon could support agriculture, but it was never the most forgiving place in the region. As long as outside communities participated, the canyon could remain powerful. Once those communities faced repeated shortages, maintaining a distant ceremonial center may have become an expensive luxury. Another possibility is that internal inequality intensified the crisis. If privileged groups retained access to stored food, rare goods, and important ceremonial spaces while ordinary households experienced increasing hardship, social cohesion could weaken. Archaeology cannot easily identify resentment, but uneven burial wealth and restricted spaces show that differences in status existed. During abundance, inequality can be tolerated or legitimized. During scarcity, the same differences may become much more difficult to accept. Migration offered an alternative. Families did not need to wait for complete disaster. They could move toward areas with better water, more reliable farming, stronger kinship connections, or emerging centers of influence. Such movements may have begun gradually, with some households leaving while others remained. A village does not have to be abandoned in a single dramatic moment. Population can thin over decades, fields fall out of use, roofs collapse, ceremonial gatherings become smaller, buildings once maintained annually begin to deteriorate. This appears to fit Chaco better than the image of sudden catastrophe. Major construction within the canyon declines during the 12th century. Some buildings continue to be used. People remain in the region. Ceremonies may still occur, but the enormous coordinated projects of earlier generations largely stop. The social energy that once poured into Pueblo Bonito, Chetro Ketl, and other great houses is redirected elsewhere. Meanwhile, new centers gain prominence outside Chaco. Aztec ruins to the north becomes especially important, with massive buildings that clearly draw from Chacoan architectural traditions. This suggests transformation rather than disappearance. Chacoan ideas, skills, and institutions move with people. The center changes even as the cultural world continues. That continuity makes the word collapse misleading if it implies that society simply ceased to exist. What is collapsing is a particular network centered on Chaco Canyon. The people are not vanishing. They are reorganizing. And as resources become more uncertain and communities shift, the archaeological record begins to reveal another, darker possibility. Across parts of the wider Southwest, settlements become more defensible. Violence appears in some human remains, and social stress may be increasing. Drought alone cannot explain what follows. The evidence begins to suggest that environmental pressure was interacting with human conflict. As Chaco's regional system weakens, the archaeological record becomes harder to read and easier to sensationalize. Some sites across the greater Southwest show signs of violence. Human remains occasionally bear injuries consistent with conflict. Settlements in certain regions become more defensively positioned. Houses are built in places that are harder to approach. Communities cluster more tightly. Burned structures appear in some contexts. These clues have encouraged the idea that the centuries surrounding Chaco's decline were marked by growing social tension, competition, and fear. Yet the evidence is uneven, and it does not support a simple picture of the entire region descending into constant warfare. Violence existed in the ancient Southwest, as it has in human societies everywhere, but its scale and causes varied greatly from one place and period to another. Some skeletal injuries clearly resulted from interpersonal conflict. Others are more ambiguous. A broken bone may reflect accident, punishment, warfare, or something archaeologists can no longer reconstruct. Burned buildings may have been destroyed intentionally, but fire was also a common hazard in structures built with timber roofs. Stored fuel and open hearths. Defensive locations can indicate fear, but communities may also move to elevated sites for reasons involving water, farming, visibility, ceremony, or social identity. The evidence remains incomplete, which makes careful interpretation essential. One of the most controversial topics involves human remains showing cut marks, burning, breakage, and other forms of modification. At several southwestern sites, archaeologists have argued that these patterns could indicate extreme violence, ritualized treatment of bodies, or even cannibalism. The subject has generated decades of debate because similar marks can sometimes result from different activities, and because claims of cannibalism have a long history of being used to stereotype indigenous peoples. A few archaeological contexts provide unusually strong evidence that human bodies were deliberately processed after death. Bones were fractured, cut, heated, or otherwise treated in ways that resemble animal butchery. At one site outside Chaco Canyon, researchers have also reported chemical evidence interpreted as supporting human tissue consumption. Yet even where body processing is clear, motive remains uncertain. Cannibalism is only one possibility: execution, ritual destruction, corpse mutilation, warfare, intimidation, or practices associated with accusations of witchcraft have all been proposed. No single explanation fully accounts for every case. The geographical distribution matters as well. These disturbing remains are not found everywhere, and they should not be treated as typical Chacoan behavior. Most ancestral Pueblo communities left no such evidence. The most sensational interpretation can easily overwhelm a much larger record dominated by farming, household life, ceremony, exchange, construction, and migration. Still, the existence of extreme violence in some communities cannot simply be ignored. If drought reduces food supplies while regional institutions weaken, competition may intensify. Communities can become suspicious of outsiders. Long-standing alliances may fail. Migration can place new populations in already occupied territories. Ritual authorities may be blamed for hardship. Leadership disputes may become more dangerous. Social pressure does not inevitably produce violence, but it creates conditions in which conflict can become harder to contain. The weakening of Chaco may therefore have involved not one crisis, but several overlapping ones. Environmental stress undermines agricultural security. Political or ceremonial institutions lose influence. Migration changes local population patterns. Competition for reliable water and farmland grows more intense in some areas. At the same time, new centers of power emerge elsewhere, giving communities alternatives to participation in the old Chacoan network. Archaeologists have sometimes searched for evidence that Chaco itself was violently overthrown. The canyon provides little support for a single dramatic destruction event. Pueblo Bonito was not burned to the ground in one final attack. The great houses were not universally smashed by invaders. There is no archaeological horizon marking a clear military conquest that suddenly ended the Chacoan system. That absence is important. The decline seems to have been gradual, uneven, and socially complex. Some rooms were intentionally sealed. Objects were deposited in ways that may reflect ritual closure. Certain buildings continued to be visited after residential use diminished. Chaco did not simply become irrelevant the moment construction stopped. This pattern fits a broader reality of societal change. People often maintain relationships with old centers long after political or economic systems have weakened. A ceremonial place can remain sacred even when fewer people live nearby. Ancestors buried within a great house continue to matter. Stories attached to roads, springs, cliffs, and buildings do not disappear simply because regional organization shifts elsewhere. The treatment of buildings may preserve traces of this process. Doorways were sometimes blocked deliberately rather than left open. Rooms may have been closed with care. Such actions can be practical, but they can also be symbolic. A place can be retired rather than abandoned. In many cultural traditions, structures associated with ancestry or ceremony require formal treatment when they cease to be used. What survives in the record suggests that leaving Chaco may have been as culturally meaningful as building it. This makes the popular image of frightened survivors fleeing a collapsing city too crude. Some people undoubtedly experienced hunger, uncertainty, and conflict. Others may have left before conditions became desperate. Migration can be a strategic choice rather than a last-minute escape. A family hearing that relatives in another valley have access to more reliable water might relocate gradually. A ceremonial group might shift its gatherings toward a new great house. Builders and ritual specialists could transfer knowledge to emerging centers. Aztec ruins north of Chaco illustrates this continuity particularly well. Major construction there expands during the late Chacoan era, and its architecture preserves clear connections to Chacoan design. Massive masonry buildings, formal room arrangements, Great Kivas, and imported materials suggest that aspects of the older system continued, but in a new geographic center. This is not what cultural extinction looks like. It looks more like reorganization. Elsewhere, communities increasingly concentrate in different parts of the Southwest. Population patterns shift toward the Mesa Verde region, the northern Rio Grande, the Little Colorado drainage, and other areas. These movements unfold over generations and do not all happen in the same direction or at the same time. Conflict may have accompanied some of them. A migrating population entering a region already occupied by other communities could create competition, but it could also be absorbed through marriage, alliance, or shared identity. Archaeology reveals both tension and integration. Pottery traditions mix. Architectural styles change. New settlements combine elements from different regions. Cultural boundaries remain fluid. This fluidity makes it difficult to identify a single group called the Chacoans after the canyon's decline. Chaco was never an isolated ethnic island. It was part of a broader ancestral Pueblo world, and the people participating in its system likely came from many communities. The apparent disappearance of Chaco is therefore partly an illusion created by ruins. Stone stays in place. People do not. The great houses remain where they were built, giving the impression that a civilization once occupied this canyon and then ceased to exist. Human communities, however, carry language, ritual, memory, craftsmanship, kinship, and identity with them. When they move, those things move too. By the 12th century, the canyon's monumental center is losing the intensity that once defined it. Construction slows, population declines, regional connections reorganize. Violence may increase in some areas, but there is no single final battle and no conqueror standing over the ruins. The silence arrives gradually, and eventually, the enormous buildings that had once drawn timber, turquoise, food, labor, and travelers from across the southwest begin to stand mostly without permanent inhabitants. The end of monumental Chaco is not marked by a final wall collapsing or a last desperate group walking away. Instead, the canyon grows quieter by degrees. Construction slows. Rooms that once required regular maintenance begin to deteriorate. Roof beams rot or are removed. Doorways are sealed. Plazas receive fewer visitors. The enormous flow of timber that once came down from distant mountains diminishes. Fewer new walls rise beside the old ones. a regional system that had spent generations drawing labor, food, rare objects, and human attention toward this narrow desert canyon gradually stops doing so. This distinction matters because abandonment is often imagined as a single event. Archaeology rarely offers such clean endings. Pueblo Bonito itself had existed through centuries of construction, remodeling, changing population, and changing purpose. It would be strange if a place with such a long history had ceased functioning in one dramatic moment. Instead, different portions of the Chacoan world appear to have declined at different rates. Some families probably left while others remained. Some rooms were abandoned while nearby spaces continued to be used. Some ceremonies may have persisted long after large-scale construction had ended. By the middle decades of the 12th century, however, the pattern is unmistakable. The extraordinary building program that had defined Chaco's peak is largely over. The canyon no longer functions as it did during the 11th century, when great houses were expanding and connections reached outward across the San Juan Basin. The reasons are layered together. Drought makes farming more difficult. Environmental uncertainty reduces the surplus available to support major gatherings. Communities once linked to Chaco face pressures of their own. The cost of transporting timber, food, and other resources becomes harder to justify. Population begins shifting toward regions offering different combinations of water, farmland, security, and social opportunity. If Chaco's institutions depended on ceremonial authority or elite leadership, their influence may weaken as the system fails to provide the stability that once made participation worthwhile. Yet there is no evidence that everyone suddenly decides Chaco has become meaningless. In fact, some archaeological deposits suggest continued attention to the great houses after their primary occupation declined. Objects were sometimes placed deliberately rather than simply discarded. Rooms were closed, doorways were blocked. Certain spaces appear to have been treated in ways that may reflect ritual termination or controlled abandonment. The difference between leaving a building and closing it is profound. A building that no longer serves its original purpose can still possess history. People remember who constructed it. Ancestors may be associated with particular rooms. Ceremonies may have taken place there for generations. The structure may belong to a sacred geography extending far beyond the walls themselves. Under those circumstances, walking away does not mean forgetting. This is one reason the popular phrase mysterious disappearance fits Chaco poorly. There is mystery in the details, certainly, but there is no evidence that thousands of people suddenly vanished without a trace. The archaeological record instead reveals population movement and cultural transformation. One destination of growing importance lies to the north. Near the Animas River in present-day New Mexico stands the settlement now called Aztec Ruins, a name created centuries later and unrelated to the Aztec civilization of central Mexico. Its major buildings reveal unmistakable Chacoan influence. The great house known as the West Ruin contains hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, formal masonry, and a reconstructed Great Kiva. Tree ring dates show major construction beginning while Chaco's regional system was still active. The relationship between Chaco and Aztec is one of the most important clues to what happens after the canyon's decline. Some researchers have suggested that regional leadership shifted northward. Builders familiar with Chacoan architecture may have participated in construction there. Ceremonial traditions could have moved with them. Populations connected to the canyon may have relocated toward the Animas Valley, where agricultural conditions differed and water was more dependable. But Aztec was not simply a replacement capital. Its architecture changes through time, and the wider region continues reorganizing. communities developed their own identities and relationships. The old Chacoan network does not move intact from one headquarters to another. Instead, pieces of it are preserved, transformed, and redistributed. This process is visible elsewhere. Throughout the northern southwest, settlement patterns become increasingly dynamic during the 12th and 13th centuries. Some areas gain population while others lose it. Villages become larger in certain regions. Architectural styles shift. Pottery traditions reveal movement and interaction among groups whose ancestors may once have participated in different parts of the Chacoan system. The people themselves carry knowledge that stone cannot show. A mason leaving Chaco knows how to build walls. A farmer carries knowledge of seeds, soils, and water. A ritual specialist carries songs, calendars, ceremonial responsibilities, and stories. Families carry ancestry. Children carry languages they learned from parents and grandparents. These things do not appear as dramatic artifacts in museum cases, but they may represent Chaco's most important surviving legacy. There is another detail that complicates the abandonment story. Great houses may have been revisited even after they ceased functioning as active centers. Descendant communities could return to ancestral places for ceremonies, offerings, or remembrance. A ruin does not necessarily become archaeologically dead simply because nobody sleeps there every night. This continuing relationship helps explain why modern archaeological language has changed. Earlier researchers frequently described Chaco and similar places as abandoned ruins belonging to a vanished people. Descendant Pueblo communities have long understood the landscape differently. These are ancestral places connected to histories that continue beyond the period archaeologists define as Chacoan. The word abandonment can therefore conceal as much as it reveals. A household might leave because water becomes unreliable, yet still regard the canyon as part of its ancestral geography. A ceremonial group could relocate while preserving traditions associated with Chaco. A family could move hundreds of kilometers away and continue telling stories that connect later generations to places their ancestors once inhabited. The physical buildings themselves gradually become part of the desert. Roofs fail first. Without constant repair, packed earth washes away and wooden beams decay. Upper walls collapse into rooms below. Wind deposits dust among fallen stones. Rodents burrow through old floors. Rainwater enters spaces that had remained dry for generations. Sandstone blocks loosen and tumble. Yet the massive masonry cores survive. Their durability creates the illusion of sudden abandonment because the walls remain while the people are gone. But between active occupation and archaeological ruin lies a long period of change, visitation, memory, and transformation. What survives in the record suggests that Chaco's decline was less like the extinction of a civilization and more like the breaking apart of a network. Its pieces travelled outward. By the 13th century, the geography of Pueblo life has changed dramatically. Large communities flourish in places far from the canyon. Some populations gather around the Mesa Verde region. Others move toward the Rio Grande Valley, the Little Colorado, the Hopi Mesas, and settlements farther south and west. Eventually, even some of these new centers will face environmental and social pressures, producing another enormous period of migration. But those later movements reveal the answer to the oldest misunderstanding about Chaco. The builders did not disappear. Their descendants continued across the southwest, carrying fragments of the Chacoan world into communities whose histories remain alive today. Once the great houses fall largely silent, the story of Chaco does not end in the canyon. It moves outward with the people who leave it. That movement is one of the most important corrections to the old image of a vanished civilization. For generations, popular accounts treated Chaco as though a mysterious population had built monumental structures, flourished briefly, and then disappeared into the desert. The archaeology tells a very different story. Populations shift, communities reorganize, traditions travel. Descendant Pueblo. Peoples preserve histories that connect them to ancestral places across the southwest, including Chaco and the broader San Juan Basin. The movement is not a single migration in one direction. Different groups leave at different times and follow different routes. Some remain in nearby regions for generations. Others move toward the northern Rio Grande, the Little Colorado, the Hopi Mesas, the Zuni area, or other parts of the southwest. Population change unfolds across centuries, and later migrations mix communities whose histories have already been shaped by earlier movements. This complexity makes it impossible to identify one simple destination for the people of Chaco. The canyon was not inhabited by a single isolated tribe with a fixed boundary around it. It was the center of a network involving many communities. Some may have spoken related languages. Others may have belonged to different social or ceremonial groups. Marriage, migration, and exchange connected populations long before Chaco's decline. When the regional system fragmented, those relationships helped determine where people could go. Kinship mattered. A family moving into another valley was not necessarily entering an unfamiliar world. Relatives might already live there. Ceremonial ties may have connected the communities. Marriage alliances could provide access to farmland, housing, or shared resources. Migrants might arrive in groups large enough to establish new neighborhoods, while still becoming part of an existing settlement. Archaeology can sometimes detect these movements through changes in pottery, architecture, food practices, and settlement layout. A ceramic tradition associated with one region begins appearing elsewhere. Building styles change. Villages expand rapidly. New forms of communal architecture emerge. These patterns can suggest migration, but they rarely provide a complete map of identity. Pottery is especially useful because it is abundant and culturally specific, yet even pottery has limits. A vessel can travel without its maker. A community can adopt another group's style. Traders can spread designs across great distances. Archaeologists, therefore, combine ceramics with tree ring dates, architectural sequences, human remains, isotope studies, and regional settlement patterns. What emerges is not a clean migration arrow, but a landscape of movement. The Mesa Verde region provides one example. During parts of the 12th and 13th centuries, substantial Pueblo populations live in the northern San Juan area, building increasingly aggregated settlements. Some communities occupy mesa tops and canyon heads. Others establish the famous cliff dwellings that would later become symbols of ancestral Pueblo life. These settlements are often treated as a separate civilization in popular storytelling, but cultural continuity links them to the broader ancestral Pueblo world. Chacoan architectural and ceremonial traditions do not simply disappear, they are transformed. The same is true farther south and east. Communities in the Rio Grande region grow significantly during later centuries. New villages appear, some containing large room blocks and ceremonial spaces. Population movement contributes to the formation of social worlds that eventually become part of the histories of modern Pueblo communities. Farther west, Hopi traditions preserve migration histories in which ancestral groups traveled across broad landscapes before joining communities on and around the mesas. These traditions are not simple archaeological maps, and they should not be treated as literal step-by-step itineraries. But they reinforce a central principle that archaeology increasingly recognizes. Movement is not an interruption of Pueblo history. It is part of Pueblo history. Migration can be purposeful, structured, and culturally meaningful. People move because environments change, but also because social relationships change. They may leave after conflict, follow relatives, join ceremonial partners, seek better farmland, respond to prophecy or ritual obligations, or combine several motives at once. This is why calling Chaco's decline a collapse can sometimes be misleading. A political or ceremonial system may collapse while the people involved survive and adapt. Monumental construction may cease while cultural traditions continue. A regional center may lose authority without its population becoming culturally extinct. What survives in the record suggests precisely this kind of transformation. The great houses themselves become ancestral places. Their walls remain connected to stories, origins, and obligations. Different Pueblo communities understand those connections in different ways, and not every tradition is shared publicly. Some knowledge is restricted for cultural or religious reasons. Archaeology does not have an automatic right to every story. That point has become increasingly important in modern research. Early archaeology in the Southwest often treated indigenous sites as abandoned scientific resources. Excavators removed human remains, ceremonial objects, pottery, and other materials with little or no consultation with descendant communities. Collections were sent to museums far from the places where they had been found. Scholars built theories about ancient Pueblo society while sometimes ignoring the knowledge of living Pueblo people. That approach has changed significantly, though tensions remain. Today, collaboration with indigenous communities increasingly shapes research, preservation, and interpretation. Descendant groups can provide perspectives on landscape, architecture, migration, ritual space, and cultural continuity that archaeological data alone cannot supply. These perspectives do not replace scientific evidence, nor does archaeology replace indigenous history. The strongest understanding often comes from recognizing that both preserve different kinds of knowledge. Chaco Canyon is especially important because it is not culturally neutral ground. For many descendant communities, the canyon is not simply a prehistoric site. It is an ancestral place. That difference matters when discussing why people left it. From a purely environmental perspective, departure can be described as adaptation to drought and declining agricultural productivity. From a social perspective, it can be described as political reorganization. From a cultural perspective, migration may also have involved deliberate decisions about where communities belonged and how ancestral relationships should continue. No single explanation fully accounts for every movement. The 13th century brings another period of major change across the northern Southwest. Many large settlements in the Mesa Verde region are abandoned by the end of the century. Populations move southward and southeastward on a remarkable scale. Again, drought plays a role, but conflict, resource pressure, and social transformation also contribute. These later migrations reinforce a pattern already visible after Chaco. Pueblo communities survive not by remaining permanently attached to one settlement, but by carrying continuity through movement. Their architecture changes. Their political arrangements change. Their landscapes change. Yet ancestry remains. This perspective reverses the usual mystery. The remarkable thing is not that Chaco's builders disappeared. The remarkable thing is that cultural continuity survived repeated droughts, migrations, regional upheavals, later colonial violence, disease, displacement, and centuries of outside pressure. Modern Pueblo communities are not archaeological leftovers from Chaco. They are living societies with their own histories extending far beyond it. Chaco forms one ancestral layer within that much larger story. And this is why the canyon's silence is deceptive. A visitor standing among Pueblo Bonito's walls hears wind moving through empty rooms. Ravens cross above collapsed masonry. The plazas hold no crowds. The roads fade into desert. But the cultural world connected to those buildings did not end there. Its descendants carried it forward. The final mystery of Chaco, then, is not disappearance. It is memory what survives, what changed, what archaeology can recover, and what remains known only within the communities whose ancestors built the canyon's extraordinary world. Today, Chaco Canyon is often encountered first as an archaeological landscape stabilized walls, protected ruins, excavated rooms, reconstructed plans, museum cases, aerial photographs, tree ring dates, and maps tracing roads across an apparently empty desert. That scientific record is essential because it allows researchers to reconstruct a remarkable amount from a society that left no written chronicles in the conventional sense. Yet Chaco is also a warning about how easily ruins can distort the story of the people who made them. Stone survives better than memory in the archaeological record, so the walls become the center of attention. The buildings seem to announce a civilization that rose, flourished, and vanished. The living continuities are harder to photograph, but they are no less real. Modern research has transformed Chaco repeatedly. Dendrochronology has provided precise construction dates for many timbers and revealed pulses of building activity that unfold across centuries rather than a single architectural boom. Chemical studies have traced some timber and food sources beyond the canyon. Residue analysis has identified cacao in unusual vessels. Ancient DNA has contributed evidence about kinship among a small number of elite burials. Remote sensing and aerial survey have revealed road segments and architectural relationships that are almost invisible from ground level. Each technique adds resolution to the picture, but none produces a complete answer. In fact, greater precision has often made Chaco more complicated. The old questions have not disappeared. They have multiplied. Researchers can show that timber came from distant mountains, but the exact organization of the labor force that transported it remains uncertain. They can identify exotic goods from far to the south, but they cannot reconstruct every exchange route or know precisely what those objects meant to the people who used them. They can map roads, but scholars still debate whether individual routes were primarily practical, ceremonial, political, ancestral, or combinations of all four. They can document inequalities in burial wealth, but the exact structure of Chacoan leadership remains unresolved. This is not failure. It is what the evidence allows. Archaeology is strongest when it distinguishes between what can be demonstrated and what remains interpretation. Chaco has attracted dramatic theories precisely because its monumental architecture seems to demand a dramatic explanation. Some popular accounts have imagined foreign colonizers, mysterious outsiders, lost civilizations, or direct control from Mesoamerican states. There is no convincing evidence for such scenarios. The people who built Chaco belong to the ancestral Pueblo world of the Southwest, even as they maintained long-distance contacts far beyond it. The genuine story is strange enough without inventing another one. A population without beasts of burden or wheeled transport moved immense timbers across difficult country. Communities in an arid basin created monumental buildings hundreds of rooms in size. Roads crossed terrain with a formal geometry that cannot always be explained by convenience. Tropical birds and cacao reached the high desert. Ceremonial spaces drew people into buildings whose scale exceeded ordinary domestic needs. Rare goods accumulated in restricted contexts. Some individuals were buried with extraordinary wealth. Then, over generations, the network weakened and its people reorganized across a much broader landscape. No supernatural explanation improves that story. What makes Chaco extraordinary is human coordination. That coordination appears in every layer of the canyon. It exists in the decision to quarry sandstone in enormous quantities. It exists in the shared architectural knowledge necessary to raise multiple stories. It exists in the transport of beams from distant forests. It exists in farming systems adapted to unreliable runoff. It exists in trade networks capable of moving objects across hundreds of kilometers. It exists in ceremonies large enough to require Great Kivas, storage, planning, and participation from dispersed communities. It also exists in memory. For descendant Pueblo peoples, Chaco cannot be reduced to an archaeological puzzle. Different communities hold different traditions about the canyon and the people associated with it. Some emphasize ancestral relationships. Others understand it as a place connected to migration, ceremony, power, danger, or lessons about how society should and should not be organized. Not all of these traditions are public, and outsiders should not assume that every sacred history exists to solve archaeological questions. That tension is important. Science seeks explanation. Cultural memory may seek continuity. The two can overlap without being identical. What survives in the record suggests that Chaco's legacy is not a single message handed down unchanged for 1,000 years. It is a field of relationships between ruins and descendants, between environment and social power, between cooperation and inequality, between resilience and overextension. Even the environmental story resists simplicity. Older narratives sometimes portrayed Chaco as a cautionary tale in which people damaged the landscape, exhausted resources, and brought collapse upon themselves. More recent work has shown how reductive that can be. Chacoans were sophisticated dryland farmers who adapted successfully to difficult conditions for generations. Drought and resource stress mattered, but they interacted with political, social, ceremonial, and demographic changes. The system did not fail because its builders lacked environmental knowledge. If anything, its long duration demonstrates the opposite. The deeper lesson may lie in scale. Small communities can adapt locally. They shift fields, modify household economies, store food, or move short distances. A large regional system is different. It ties many communities together through shared expectations, roads, ceremonies, tribute or exchange, monumental construction, and prestige all create commitments. As long as the network produces value, those commitments strengthen it. When environmental conditions deteriorate or legitimacy weakens, the same connections can become difficult to sustain. Chaco therefore offers a pattern visible in many human societies without becoming identical to any of them. Complexity creates opportunity, but it also creates dependency. Monumental centers can unite communities, but they can concentrate resources and authority. Networks can spread risk until an entire network experiences pressure at once. And when a center declines, survival may depend on leaving it. That is perhaps the most enduring part of Chaco's history. The great houses do not survive because people remain trapped inside them. The people survived because they could change. They carried architectural traditions into new settlements. They reorganized communities. They preserved relationships with ancestral places while building lives elsewhere. Over centuries, those descendants endured further migrations and transformations, followed eventually by Spanish colonization, missionization, epidemic disease, violence, land loss, and political pressure. Still, Pueblo communities survived. Against that deeper history, the supposed disappearance of Chaco becomes almost the wrong story to tell. The canyon is not evidence that a people vanished. It is evidence that a particular way of organizing people, places, resources, and belief came to an end while the human communities behind it continued. And so the broad roads fading into the desert do not lead into nothing. The rooms without roofs are not empty of history. The Great Kivas are not merely circular holes in the ground. They belong to a landscape whose meaning was built over generations and never fully disappeared when monumental construction stopped. Chaco Canyon remains difficult precisely because it refuses to become one thing. It is architecture, pilgrimage, politics, trade, ancestry, astronomy, labor, drought, inequality, cooperation, migration, memory. Every explanation illuminates one part and leaves another in shadow. Perhaps that is why the canyon still feels so powerful. Its walls preserve enough to reveal an extraordinary world, but never enough to make that world completely familiar. The canyon is quieter now than it was 1,000 years ago, but it is not empty. Wind moves through doorways that once opened into roofed rooms. Sunlight slides slowly across sandstone walls, touching masonry laid by hands whose names are gone but whose work remains. In the broad plazas, dust gathers where people once crossed between ceremonies, storage rooms, households, and gathering spaces. Far beyond the canyon, the old roads fade into the desert, their lines interrupted by erosion, vegetation, and time. The forests that supplied Chaco's timbers still stand in distant mountains. Summer storms still gather over the high plateau. Rain still arrives unevenly, filling washes for a few hours before the land dries again. The same environment that shaped the choices of Chaco's builders continues to surround the ruins, indifferent to the rise and decline of human institutions. And perhaps that is the image worth keeping. Civilizations rarely disappear in the simple way ruins suggest. Buildings become silent long before memory does. Political systems dissolve while families continue. Ceremonies change. Languages travel. People leave old homes and carry pieces of those places into new ones. What appears from a distance to be collapse can, at the scale of human lives, be a long sequence of decisions about where to plant, whom to trust, what to preserve, and when it is finally necessary to move. Chaco Canyon survives because stone remembers differently from people. Stone holds the shape of rooms. People carry meaning. For centuries, archaeologists have measured walls, counted beams, traced roads, studied pottery, and reconstructed rainfall. Those efforts have revealed an extraordinary ancient world, yet part of Chaco will always remain beyond complete recovery. The exact ceremonies are gone from the archaeological record. The motivations of individual builders are silent. The reasons one family stayed while another left can never be known. But uncertainty does not diminish the canyon. It makes the surviving evidence more precious. At sunset, the sandstone changes color slowly. Shadows lengthen inside Pueblo Bonito. The great houses begin to merge with the cliffs behind them, and for a moment the distinction between architecture and landscape almost disappears. The people who built this place understood that landscape intimately. They built within it. They struggled against it. They depended upon it, and eventually many of them left it. The walls remained. The descendants continued, and beneath the enormous desert sky, Chaco became what it still is today, not the grave of a vanished civilization, but a place where time, memory, survival, and absence remain visible together.